Hey dreamers, if you've had a paranormal encounter that you'd like to share with the show, you can write in or record a message using your phone and send it to somedreamland@gmail.com. Or you can follow the link in the show notes to use our voice message system. If you're enjoying the show, please don't forget to follow, subscribe, rate, and leave a review with your favorite podcatcher. Also, find and follow us on Facebook and Twitter using @somedreamland. And while you're at it, please let your friends and family know about the show, as this will only help to grow our audience and enable us to bring you more quality content in the future. As always, thank you for listening. It is much appreciated.
You're about to enter a podcast filled with high strangeness, conspiracies, the paranormal, and legends from around the world, with your host, Ken Mark, and brought to you by WNIP Productions. This is Somewhere in Dreamland.
Welcome back, dreamers. Tonight, my guest is Chad Lewis. Chad is a researcher, author, and lecturer on topics of the strange and unusual. With a bachelor's and master's degree in psychology, Chad has spent the last 20 years scouring the globe in search of unique and bizarre stories. And he has researched everything from vampires in Transylvania to the beast of Bray Road in Wisconsin. So without further ado, grab your blanket, turn down the lights, get comfy, and let's fade away into
Dreamland.
Well, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing terrific. How are you?
I'm good. You're up. Do you live in Wisconsin?
I do. I'm in northern Wisconsin. Eau Claire is the town.
Okay. It's cold up there, isn't it?
Yeah, we're in the 40s today.
Yeah, I'm originally from Ohio, and it's kind of the same story, you know.
Where are you at now?
We moved to South Carolina about a year and a half ago. I'm real close to Charleston, about 15, 20 minutes from Charleston.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so it's beautiful here all the time. I mean, that's just a plus, right? You know, like you got the beach right here, and then I mean, it gets maybe 40 degrees in the wintertime, maybe. And that's only a couple days here and there, you know?
Yeah, that's nice.
No snow. I like that.
I bet. Yeah.
You do miss it like once a year, you know, like Christmas time. I miss it then, but.
Yeah, I imagine. It's nice if you're not here the entire winter, if you can, pop down to Florida or something for a week or so.
Yeah. There's a lot of crazy stuff up in Wisconsin, man. It's a cool state.
Yeah, we have our fair share of weird stuff, that's for sure.
Yeah. I think that whole Great Lakes region up there is just weird. Like, Ohio is really a super weird state, too. There's so much going on in that state.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's something about this Great Lakes area.
You've pretty much traveled the world, huh?
Yeah, I've traveled the world searching for the weird and unusual. I try to stay in the Midwest, but every place has so many unique legends that it's hard not to explore further.
Yeah, I'll bet, man. I'll bet. I myself would love to do that. Just be able to go out and check all this cool stuff out, you know?
Yeah, and it's never ending. I mean, I've been doing this 25 plus years, and I'm still learning every single day of new cases, new folklore, all kinds of stuff. I don't think could do it 75 years and never run out of things to learn.
Yeah, probably not. I think you're right there. So you've written like what, 20 some books?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, I read a couple of the Wisconsin one, the ghost stories, I believe.
Sure.
I think the other one that I read was about Peppy. Is that how you say it?
Yes, Peppy. That is the lake monster. There's a $50,000 reward attached to that creature.
That is crazy, man.
As of today, nobody obviously has taken it, the reward, but it's still out there.
That is really a cool part of that whole tale right there.
It really is. I think it's following in the footsteps of P.T. Barnum, who back in the 1800s offered, $10,000 for Lake Champlain's monster Champ, which nobody collected that. But, so it's following in that tradition of offering a reward. And you wouldn't believe how much media that received because of the reward attached to it, that normally that media wouldn't have covered just a sea serpent story.
Yeah, I'll bet it ramped up tourism a lot too.
Well, that was his whole purpose for it. He said, they asked him, the guy who put it together also runs a boat tour of the old paddle boats on the lake, which is a lake on the Mississippi River. And they said, what are you going to do if somebody collects the $50,000? And he said, it'll be the best $50,000 I ever invested, because so many more people will come here because of it.
Isn't that the truth?
And I'm always, this is, and maybe we can talk about this in the show as well, but this is, for me, when skeptics say that people and places are using their legends to make money and grab tourists. Well, of course they are. Why wouldn't they? If you have a beautiful lake in your area, you're using it to draw tourists. If you have snowmobiling, or if you have wineries, you're using any other natural resources. Why wouldn't you use local legends?
Right.
You'd be foolish not to. For me, it doesn't mean that it's any less credible than if they weren't using it to draw in tourists.
I agree with you 100%. So you have a Bachelor and Master degree in psychology. What got you into traveling the world and chasing the monsters, ghosts, and legends?
I blame my interest in the paranormal on my home state of Wisconsin, because not only do we have the UFO capital of the world here, we have 3 cities that all claim to be the UFO capital of the entire world. And growing up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, I grew up near one of those capitals. So when I was in high school, I heard of people in the nearby town of Elmwood seeing UFOs, one of these capitals. So I started going there and interviewing people, just trying to figure out what the heck they were seeing in the skies. And then it just so happened that I was studying psychology at college the next fall. And that's what I was really interested in, is why do some people believe in all of this stuff and others do not? What is it about our human perception or our belief systems that makes some of us wired to believe in this and others were not? So that's what I was really interested in. And it just kind of went through graduate school, and I ended up doing my master's thesis on students' belief in the paranormal, looking at whether they believe in ghosts or sea serpents or Bigfoot or crop circles. And that was what interested me, is why do some people believe in this?
That is very interesting. So what about you? What do you believe?
Well, I guess it depends on the day you ask me that. And I don't mean that, sarcastically. What I mean is that I've been doing this for so long that I'm still left with more questions than answers, where every time I think I have a theory to explain something, I might get a new case or read somebody's new book, and it makes me go right back to square one. So I think these things are happening. I've talked to and interviewed too many people over the years that are rational, logical, down-to-earth people that are not hallucinating. They're not making it up. They're not hoaxing it. I think something's happening, but the problem is I don't know what that something is. So I firmly believe when somebody says they saw a UFO, that they believe they saw one, or a ghost, that they believe they truly encountered that. But is it something that could be encountered by someone else? I don't know.
Right. Well, that's kind of the fun part about the paranormal, isn't it? I mean, it's you may see something and I may not, and we're both standing there, and that's the whole, to me, that's the draw of the paranormal, the not knowing, the not having that evidence, and I think that makes it fun.
I agree completely. And so many things just do not make sense when it comes to the strange and unusual. Like you said, there could be four of us in a field and we see a ghost or something come up, and four of us could draw it and it would be completely different for everybody. Are we seeing the same thing with just a different view of our mind, or is it projecting itself differently to each person, or is it even there in the first place? And it really is a rabbit hole when you start thinking of so much high strangeness that doesn't fit into any known category.
Yes, sir. I agree with you there. Those degrees come in handy when you're out there too, don't they?
I think it's really important when interviewing a witness that normally when you interview somebody and they're acting very nervous, or they're evading eye contact, or they're fidgeting and touching their face quite often, those normally would be signs of somebody being not so truthful, trying to deceive you. But yet, when you're dealing with somebody who may have had their entire belief system shifted from seeing what they thought was a werewolf when they never thought these things existed, obviously you're going to exhibit some of those symptoms.
Yeah.
If you think you just saw some chupacabra creature that isn't known to science, you might be a little nervous and skittish as well. So sometimes you can't quite make that assessment just based on physical characteristics, but it does help for leading people away from leading questions. And as probably a lot of your listeners know, that a lot of what we do in this field sometimes feels like you're a counselor or a social worker.
Yeah,
that people will contact you and may not necessarily even want you to investigate, but they just want to make sure they're not going crazy.
Yeah, I bet.
I saw this, and have you ever heard of that before? Because I don't want to be the only one. I don't want to lose my mind. And a lot of them take comfort and solace in the fact that, yes, other people have reported this.
Yep. They usually start those with, I know I'm not crazy, or this is going to sound crazy. I've heard that plenty of times.
Yes, I love it when people say, I don't believe in ghosts, but this is what happened to me, or I don't believe in Bigfoot, but here's an odd sighting. So oftentimes we think of these sightings and experiences coming from diehard believers. But what I found over the years is it runs the entire spectrum, from people that are diehard believers to diehard skeptics and everybody in between.
Yeah, I'll bet it does. That's another cool part of it, right?
It really is. And it also runs the whole gamut, from those who are highly educated to those without a lot of formal education, to those who are rural versus urban. Religiosity doesn't seem to matter. Age, gender. So there doesn't seem to be this rhyme or reason where if it only happened to, white men over 60 that live in a town of 20,000 or fewer people, it would be a lot easier to investigate those things. But you get sightings in some of the biggest cities where you would think that's impossible.
Yeah. So out of everything that you have researched, you've done so far, what is the one thing that sticks with you to this day? The one case or the one thing you've researched?
For me, without a doubt, it is the creature or spirit or whatever it is called the Windigo.
Oh, yeah.
And it might be the oldest North American legend and perhaps the least known North American legend. But it's one of those cases or folklore where I did a book with my colleague, Kevin Lee Nelson. Last year, we put out a book after a decade or so of researching it. And every time I'm asked about it, I say that I think I'll be able to research the Windigo until the day I die and never feel like I fully understand the legend or the folklore. And for your listeners that don't know, the Windigo started as a First Nations creature or spirit up in Canada with the people in the Alberta area, and it was thought to be this hideous monster that would come during times of harsh winter when starvation was settling in and there was no game to be found or no food to be discovered, and people would resort to cannibalism. And that's when the Wendigo would show up and either devour you or, worse yet, slowly possess you and turn you into a Wendigo.
It's creepy.
Yeah, and when you think of a creature or a form or a being that is impervious to everything. I mean, it's some sort of elemental being. It walks in a straight line because why wouldn't it? If you don't have anything in your way, it can get as big as it wants, and the more it consumes, the larger it gets. And it just, really thin, skeletal looking. Sometimes it's missing its own mouth and lips because in its insatiable hunt for human flesh, it consumes its own body when there's no victims to be found. I mean, a terrifying creature, so terrifying that we have actual reports of people starving in their lodging because they heard there was a Wendigo in the vicinity and they were too afraid to go outside to get food just on the mere mention that a Wendigo was in the area. So they starved to death instead.
Wow. That's crazy.
It really is. It's unlike there's no other creature in North America that instilled the fear and terror that the Wendigo did. Again, just the mere mention of it, people would abandon the village, the tribe, the town, whatever it was. They would abandon the area until the Wendigo had passed through.
There's a really famous story that's correlated with the Wendigo, isn't it? Swift Runner, am I thinking that right?
Yes, you are. And Swift Runner, if any of your listeners have ever heard of Wendigo, they probably heard the tale of Swift Runner. And Swift Runner was a Cree, a First Nations man up in north of Edmonton in Alberta. And it was the winter of 1878 through 79. And Swift Runner was about 40 winters of age at that time. And he snapped, went crazy, ended up murdering, killing, and consuming his entire family. And then he was captured and brought to the gallows and was executed for being a Wendigo.
Wow. That's crazy. I bet there aren't too many people that can say that they were accused of being a Wendigo and hung, are there?
No, most of them were killed by their own people. When somebody was turning Wendigo or going Wendigo, and signs of turning Wendigo parallel signs of mental illness quite a bit, removing yourself from society, seeing things that aren't quite there, hearing things, personality changes, where now all of a sudden you start seeing your friends and family not as loved ones, but as juicy game animals like beaver. And you stop eating and you start getting very sick. And most of the time, people who thought they were turning Wendigo begged to be killed because they did not want to turn into a Wendigo and harm their loved ones. So a lot of people that were in the stage of turning Wendigo were often killed by their own loved ones.
There's so much going on with that story, like so many different, I see what you're saying. There's so many different aspects because you have the tie-in with the kind of mental illness thing. Plus, you're in some harsh weather up there in the north. So that probably plays a factor in the cabin fever and probably lending its hand to that mental illness if it is a mental illness. And then on top of that, you pile the story of the Wendigo on top of it, and you're not sure exactly what's going on,
That's really the trouble with it. And so much of the early reporting of it, or at least the written documentation, all the earlier stuff was lost. It's oral. And unfortunately, a lot of that has been lost to history. But a lot of the written word of it was kind of tainted by the researchers of the day because they looked at it as it could not possibly be true that these were mostly the First Nations and Native American people that were experiencing it at that time, that they were primitive in thought, that they must have made it up. They're superstitious. We can't blame them. They don't know any better. They're not as smart as we do. My colleague Kevin Nelson and I call it white-splaining.
Yeah.
That today we look back and we say, oh, they must have been, crazed. This couldn't be real. But when you look at some of the evidence that they found back then, we have no reason to doubt that it didn't happen. For instance, a telltale sign of the Wendigo possessing you is ice forming on the inside of your body. Usually your heart will be consumed in ice. And oftentimes when people were killed for being a Wendigo, when they opened up the body, they found ice inside, the heart encased in ice, or the spine having ice running down it.
Wow.
And they were pretty certain that it was ice, and we have no reason to doubt them. So if it wasn't the Wendigo, you start to look at what other physical maladies could form ice inside the human body. And I'm not a doctor, so I don't know, but everything we researched, we found no other stories of people just forming ice. Even in the heart of Wisconsin here, where it gets cold, people don't form ice on their insides.
Yeah, that's bizarre.
And sometimes they were so afraid that the person would come back that they would go to great lengths to kill them over and over and over. And I mean over and over and over in the fact that they were dead right away, but they just kept doing other things to pile onto that. And then eventually you'd have to cremate the body so there was nothing left. Otherwise, the spirit of the Wendigo could merely go back into the woods and wait for the next person to go out gathering or hunting and then possess them, and the cycle would start all over again.
Wow. Has there been any recent cases involving somebody saying the Wendigos possessed them?
I don't have any recent possession cases, but I do have many recent cases of people that claim they have seen one or encountered one. I have one in northern Wisconsin from a few years back where two brothers at a summer camp in the dead of summer saw some weird creature in the woods, very thin, and it was like they walked into a zone of terror. They'd never been afraid of anything before that, like that. Like, it wasn't like stumbling upon a bear where you're going to be scared, but yet it's a natural fear. Right. They walked into something that they felt this thing was out to get them. And they had never heard of the Wendigo, and they went home and kind of put in the description in the Google and eventually came to images of the Wendigo, and they think that's what they saw. But often today's sightings of what are thought to be Wendigo are much different than the original folklore, where today, if you Google Wendigo, most likely you'll get some drawing or image or painting with horns on it, antlers.
Yeah.
And that was not present in the early Wendigo folklore, which is one of the areas that I love studying, is how folklore is not stagnant. It's always moving and shifting. Over decade after decade, it's changing. So it's possible that the Wendigo did change to have antlers over the years, or that some of the more mass media stuff with antler depicted maybe influenced people, and they're starting to see the way it was portrayed in the media.
Yeah. Media is a pretty powerful thing.
It really is. And you can kind of see how it affects people. Someone contacted me not too long ago, a year or two, and said that they were out hunting with their buddy, and that they were hunting, and all of a sudden they heard their buddy yelling for them. And they heard something in the woods, and they thought, that's weird. My friend's supposed to be such and such distance away. But they swore the friend was kind of yelling for them. And then they saw something hideous in the woods and ran back to camp. And then when the friend got back, they said, why are you calling me? What was that about? And the friend said, I was miles away. And what they thought, it was the Wendigo mimicking the voice of their friend. And that was actually presented in a episode of the TV show Supernatural, where the Wendigo creature could mimic the sounds of their friends and lure people out. And that's not anywhere in the traditional literature. So what you saw here, somebody may have seen that episode and said, oh, this thing mimics, it had to be the Windigo.
Yeah. Yep. It's what it sounds like. Well, I want to talk to you about something. One of my favorite things. I want to really pick your brain about this. So I see that you've done some research on the Tata Duende and Gnomes. And if there's one thing that scares the hell out of me and gives me the willies, it's gnomes, especially the garden variety. Because I had a creepy story, the creepy thing that happened to me with a garden gnome one time. I don't like garden gnomes, but my neighbor had one in their backyard. And I came home one night, and it was about 1 a.m. I was gonna jump in my hot tub, and I always eyeball this thing. It sits like back by her shed, way back in her yard, and she's got one of those mercury vapor lights above her shed, and it shines right on that thing. And I don't like them at all. So I got in the hot tub, and I looked at the garden gnome, and I got in the hot tub and was in there for about a half an hour and thought I heard something, and I got up and looked right over there, and that garden gnome was gone, man. And that was it for me. I didn't even close the hot tub up. I just went in the house. I was done with it. So I'm really interested in hearing some of the stuff that you've researched about the gnomes and the duende.
It's amazing how many people are fearful of the little gnome statues and porcelain, even cement ones, for how popular they are. A lot of people have a adverse reaction to them when they see them. So you're not alone.
Good. They're creepy, man.
But throughout history, gnomes, which often get thrown in with, gnomes, goblins, trolls, fairies, the hidden folk, the good people, sprites, all these different names for different creatures, if you will, but they're all the fairy folk kind of thing, where they seem to be supernatural in nature and often do not have our benefit or our feelings first at hand, that they're up to some sinister motives throughout history. That's one thing that's usually agreed upon, is that they're out for their own beings, which makes sense at the time. But yeah, throughout history, people have been fearful of not only being fairy led away from these creatures into their realm and never returning, but abducted by them, taken by them, tricked by them. So you start getting all these cultures around the world saying very similar things, and it makes you wonder, are they all experiencing something that is similar, or are they all making up very similar folklore?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, even in the United States, there's a lot, especially up around the Great Lakes region again, right? There's a lot of stories of the wood folk and stuff like that, and it's really crazy how all over the world, you kind of have that same theme, and it's mind-blowing to me.
And it goes back many years. Lewis and Clark, on their adventures out west, encountered Spirit Mound in South Dakota, where their guides told them, don't go up there. There are these little devil-like creatures, gnomes, that would shoot arrows that could kill you. And they were terrific shots, and that we avoid this mountain because this hill, because it is inhabited by these little people. So you have these stories all over the world, and sometimes they change a bit. Of course, each area puts its local flair on it, but very eerily similar, that these things are happening everywhere for hundreds and hundreds of years.
I was talking to a friend of mine one time about this, and he says he thinks that they are extraterrestrials. He put it together to me, and I don't exactly remember how he matched that up, but he says, yeah, they just didn't know, they didn't have a term for extraterrestrial back then, so they named them gnomes and fairies and things like that. What do you feel about that?
I think a lot of researchers now are putting it together, the similarities of, again, if you were abducted in the old days, it was the fairies' fault or the gnomes. But today it's extraterrestrials, where there's a lot of similarities in those stories of being taken by some being against your will, not being returned. And again, 400 years ago, we would blame it on fairies, and today it's extraterrestrial beings. So there's a lot of great research out there now. Joshua Cutchin is doing a lot of that work of looking at the similarities between the old fairy lore with extraterrestrial or, abduction or experiencer literature. And I think it's fascinating because if you use the right lens, a lot of it does seem to overlap. And the argument is made that people of the old days were explaining it the best way they could. They obviously weren't thinking of interdimensional travel or travel from other planets. That wasn't on their radar. So they were explaining it the best way they could, where today we're explaining it the best way we can. I'm interested in 200 years from now, if this phenomena is still happening, how are they going to explain it?
Yeah, me too.
Maybe one of your listeners that'll live that long can solve the question.
Yeah. Man, yeah, it is. I mean, like you said, they overlap quite a bit. So, and I don't take anybody's ideas ever or their thoughts, and I'm not going to judge them, because I have my own thoughts and stuff about everything, as does everybody else. But so I kind of just take everything and I listen to it. I mean, what's it going to hurt?
I think you're spot on there. I think far too often in this field, when somebody throws it out, especially in those circumstances where they're throwing it out as a thought experiment, that you may not agree with it. You might think it's total bunk, but I think it's important. That's how things progress. You throw out theories, you test them, they don't work, you move on, or they work. And I really, if somebody comes up to me and says that they believe, one of the books I did was on the Van Meter Visitor, this giant bat-like creature down in Iowa. And I can't tell you how many people have come up to me and told me their theory of what it was or is, and expecting me to argue with them saying, nope, that's not what I think. Or I think instead I say, that's very interesting. Who knows? Maybe you're right.
Yeah.
There are no, I guess, in my mind, and lots of people in this field would disagree with me, there are no answers out there right now. I don't think, to my understanding, nobody has solved what Bigfoot may or may not be, or what UFOs are, or what ghosts, nobody has proved or disproved them. So I think sometimes when people say my answer is the only answer, I think sometimes you get stuck in that black or white category that, well, it has to be flesh and blood, or it has to be something ultra-terrestrial or some high strangeness, where I think sometimes you can exclude cases because you already have made up your mind.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you can still have an open mind, but close it every once in a while. And I think too many people in this field do that.
And that happens quite a bit. Often people ask me about my thoughts on cryptids, whether they're flesh and blood or something other. And usually my answer is both, because it doesn't fit into any category. Where when you think of Bigfoot, for instance, people say it has to be flesh and blood because it leaves footprints. It certainly might be leaving behind hair or droppings or scat. And all that would make it seem like it's a flesh and blood creature. But then on the flip side, you think, well, we haven't found a body. There's no conclusive DNA beyond a doubt where you say this is 100% Bigfoot. And then there are cases where people see it disappearing right before their eyes. So it doesn't make sense on either side, but yet so many people in the field are entrenched on that one side that I don't think they look at the other side. And until, there is conclusive evidence either way, I think we should be open to all theories, even if they are obscure and sometimes very outlandish. For instance, I was done at a program, lecturing at a conference, and after the program, a gentleman came up to me and several of my colleagues and said, you have to come out to my farm. I have several Bigfoot creatures living on my property. This was about 9 o'clock at night. We said, sure, let's go. This sounds awesome.
Right.
And as we were packing up our gear, he said, oh, I should warn you. You're not going to be able to see them because they're in a different dimension and only I can see them. So right away you think, okay, that's getting kind of far out there, but let's go with it. And then he said, oh, and they're probably busy because they do the same things we do. They have barbecues and pool parties and they're hanging out. And there you can kind of see like the interest just dropped in our eyes. But
yeah,
I always state that when you're dealing with the weird, what is too weird? Where do you draw that line? Because I think sometimes if you say this is too weird to believe, you would miss out on a lot of good stories.
Very true.
Now, in my personal belief, I don't think Bigfoot are having pool parties and barbecue, but who knows? It's a fun story. I loved listening to it, but I don't subscribe to it. But yet, I think that always hits me back as, well, where do I draw the line? If somebody says they saw a vampire, is that too weird? Or what about the first people that were recording Chupacabra sightings? What do you mean it looks like Sonic the Hedgehog running around? That can't be right.
Right.
So I think sometimes if you think that way, you might limit what might be coming, new creatures, new stories.
Can you imagine that pool filter? That's what I'm worried about, that pool filter. Then Bigfoot swimming around in it.
Yeah, I know. And what are they barbecuing?
Yeah, right.
Hopefully not investigators.
Right, exactly. Well, hey, I want to go back. I want to talk about the Van Meter visitor because it's one of my favorite cases because I feel like it doesn't get its credit. And it's such a fascinating case because most of the people who witnessed this were very prominent figures in the town. Isn't that right?
Up until I did the Windigo book, and depending on the day you ask me, the Van Meter visitor is up there maybe as the weirdest thing I've ever investigated because it doesn't make sense. And the quick synopsis is that in 1903, a small town in Iowa called Van Meter of about 900 people, 20 minutes southwest of Des Moines, for 5 nights were seemingly attacked or terrorized anyway by this giant 8-9 foot bat-like creature that had a horn on its head and it could project light, it could erase memories, and it was impervious to weapons. People fired at it and it had no effect on it. And again, it's one of those things that I said, this can't be real. It's just too weird. I never heard of anything like this. Sure, you have stories of Mothman and Spring-Heeled Jack and others where this giant bat-like creatures, but bat that has a horn on its head and it can produce light and it releases an odor that'll wipe out your memory, that can't be possible. But yet, according to the newspaper accounts of the time, as you said, some of the most prominent men in Van Meter spotted it. It was the bank manager, superintendent of schools, the local doctor, business owners. These were people who were very reputable in the community who put their name to the sighting. Does it mean it really happened? No, but I think it adds some credibility in my eyes.
It does in mine too, because when you look at this case, it isn't like they were trying to drum up the so-called tourism or anything they were truly terrified, these people.
And not only that, they actively told people not to come.
Right.
They said, don't come here. There's nothing to see. Forget about it kind of thing, where unless they were using great reverse psychology, telling people not to come, hoping they would come, they weren't trying to profit off of this.
And there was the town wasn't big either. It wasn't like it was just a little old town in 1903, right?
It really was. It was 900 people, a couple city blocks, small blocks, which it's kind of remained the same size. If anything, it has shrunk over the years Back then, they had a couple saloons and a couple hotels, and really 2 main blocks of their main drag. And on the outskirts of town was this old abandoned coal mine right next to the brick and tile factory, and that was about it. So you're in small town, 1903. It's not like you just call the sheriff or the police and they'll come check it out for you. That's not going to happen. The National Guard's not going to arrive in Van Meter and check it out. You're on your own. And that's really what they did. They formed a posse of men out at the old abandoned coal mine. And they said, we're going to try to kill or capture this thing, because they knew help wasn't coming. They were the help.
They think that it crawled out of that abandoned mine, didn't they?
That was one of the theories, is that the miners, while most people don't think of Iowa as a big coal producing place, but it was at that time. They had several mines in Van Meter, bringing out mini loads of train cars every single day of coal. It was about 300 feet deep, had miles and miles of tunnels, teams of donkeys working down there. So it was a big operation. And some people at that time believed that they simply let out something that shouldn't have been there. One of the superintendent of high schools there in town at the time, 1903, he claimed that it was this antediluvian creature, something out of biblical times, that was released from the mine when they had dug too deep. And being that it only seemed to appear at night that we know of, it would make sense if it was living in complete darkness its whole life.
It would also make sense that it had that light on its head, if it did, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You would think it would need some lighting to survive somewhere. And that was one of the theories. And that theory is that some believe it just simply went back down there, and it's still in a series of tunnels and cave systems living throughout the entire U.S.
Wow. Was there a second smaller one sighted there too, along with it?
There was. So there was 4 nights where the only reported creature was the same, or what we think might be the same one. I guess it could have been because details were so lacking as to the color and general description of it in a physical manner, that it could have been several of them, one every night appearing. But on the 5th night, as it was just getting dark, they heard what sounded like, to their words, Satan and a regiment of his imps were coming up from hell to wage war on Van Meter. And then they saw this thing, the same thing, presumably, that they had been seeing all week. And then it had a smaller version of itself, maybe the female gender or the offspring, I don't know. And so there was at least 2 of them that were spotted. They both had lights and could produce light, but there may have been more. I don't know. So much of it's lacking is that we have 5 nights of newspaper accounts, and that's it.
Now I heard claims that there was a footprint found and a cast taken. Is that?
Yes. Mr. Dunn, who worked at the bank at the time, thought that the town was just being raided by a bank robber or a practical joker of some sorts that was going to try to go into the bank and steal the town's money. So he actually left his family at home unprotected, grabbed his shotgun full of buckshot, and went down to the bank to protect the town's money. And about 1 a.m., he heard what sounded like somebody was strangling outside, like couldn't breathe, choking. And this bright light was flashing, almost blinding him in the bank. He said it was, darting back and forth as though it was searching for something or someone. And he couldn't take it anymore. He blasted out the front window of the bank at this thing, and it disappeared right away. So the next morning, he goes out there, and he thinks he's going to find a dead body, or at least some fur, feathers, if it was an animal, blood, something, but there's nothing there. He thought maybe he overreacted, went crazy, hallucinated it. That is until they went around the back of the muddy bank building, and there in the back, they said they found giant 3-toed tracks of some creature. And according to the newspaper, he took at least 1 plaster cast of that footprint or that paw print or whatever it was. But what became of it, we don't know. It seems to have been lost to history if it was ever casted.
Right. Now, was anything ever seen after that last night? Ever again, maybe in a neighboring town, anything like that?
We don't know right after the 1903. They said they boarded up the opening and they were going to devise a plan to exterminate the creatures, but they never told us what that plan was.
Okay.
And for generations, many decades, the town kind of forgot about this story. As weird as it sounds, how do you forget about that? Yeah. They did. Kids would go out there to the old brick and tile factory buildings because they were in disrepair and not a lot left of them. And they thought it was haunted out there. They would hear weird noises. They would see shadowy forms. But because no one heard the story or remembered the story of the visitor, they just thought it was haunted. But since the research we've started collecting, we found that people have been seeing weird things in the general vicinity for many decades. One man was a pastor, and he was in nearby Colfax, which is probably about 40 miles away, not too long ago. And he was waiting for his buddy when he looked up into the sky and he saw what appeared to be a dragon flying around. And he watched it until it left his field of vision. And when he went home, he Googled Iowa dragon, and the Van Meter visitor popped up and he said, "That's what I saw."
Wow.
So he wasn't even aware of the legend, but we get stories like that quite a bit of people saying, "Hey, I stumbled across your visitor book and I think I saw that thing."
That's crazy, isn't it?
It really is. Again, in modern day times, somebody's seeing something that shouldn't be here.
And that the fact that this guy didn't know anything of the story lends a little bit of credibility in my book anyway, to him maybe seeing it, actually seeing something.
Yes, I think I've always struggled with the confirmation bias of people that take Pepe the Lake Monster, for instance, that when the story comes out and it gets a lot of publicity, and people start seeing it more, skeptics will say, well, obviously they've heard the stories and now every little lateral wave in the water or every little duck swimming around, people are going to mistake it for a sea serpent. But I think that might be true to some extent. But on the flip side, you also have to consider that because the story gets a lot more attention, people are specifically looking for it now. That now they're out looking for the sea serpent, where normally they might just focus on their bobber or their fishing pole and not really scan their surroundings. But because they heard a story of a sea serpent, they're on the lookout for it. So it makes sense more people would see it.
Yep. Sure enough. Well, hey, I want to talk to you about another one of my favorites. And I know that you've researched this and I'm excited to talk to you about it. And we probably don't have enough time talk about everything because I know this is a huge subject, but you mentioned Mothman. That's one of the coolest stories out there, and I feel like it's so cool because it's not like your average town sees a monster story, right? It's like once you start digging in this story, there are so many branches of it that are just crazy, from like Woody Derenberger to Indrid Cold, and you got the Men in Black and the UFO flaps that happened all around the same time as the Mothman sightings. And I just kind of want to get your take on that. Like, I know you've been there and researched it, and I want to know what you think.
If any of your listeners have never read John Keel's The Mothman Prophecies, I recommend you read it, because when I read it, I was confused as all get out. I was thinking, what is going on? Am I still in reality here? What is happening? This book is so disorienting that I loved it, but it was what's happening here?
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah, agreed.
So, yeah, I love it. One of my colleagues and friends, Steve Ward, he does the hay rides out at the festival where he talks about the Mothman sightings, and he was been there for 40 some years when he first started researching it. And the case just is one of those things where it seems to get weirder and weirder every year. And not so much in like modern sightings, but just more stuff comes out that was unknown, or more information comes forward. And it's just one of those cases that is just mind-boggling. If you believe that it happened the way people said it happened, it's one of the weirdest cases out there.
If you go to that town, man, Point Pleasant, they really, truly, honestly believe that happened. You aren't telling them that it didn't.
And what's interesting is, again, there's a lot of these similarities when you look at Mothman happening out at the old TNT site, these big domes from the war. And then in Van Meter, this abandoned coal mine on the outskirts of town, and other stories of these cryptids in these abandoned places or neglected places or hidden places. And when you start to throw in that it's more than just, especially with Mothman, more than just cryptid sightings, you're getting, as you said, possibly men in black or other type creatures. You get people seeing UFOs and having all kinds of physical reactions to these things, that it's not just somebody seeing a ghost in a haunted hallway of an old inn. These things seem to be some paranormal beacon or portal, if you will, where all this high strangeness is happening in such a small area.
That whole Ohio River Valley through there, that area is just, it's one of the weirdest areas. There's so many stories through there, Chad. I mean, you have the Loveland Frogmen, you have, so many stories that isn't funny. And I always wonder, growing up in Ohio, what makes it so crazy like that? I'd really like to know.
And I love what are almost one-offs, or the Loveland Frog, where you had a couple sightings over a couple nights. But then for a lot of these stories, these things seem to appear, interact with people intentionally or unintentionally, and then they're gone.
Yeah.
Where'd they go? What happened? And then sometimes when you're talking Bigfoot or Big Muddy Monster or other sightings where it's gone for several decades, but then all of a sudden there's another flap. Yeah. And you're thinking, where are these things going? What's happening? If they're flesh and blood and they're living in an area, you would think they'd be spotted more often than every couple decades, but just very perplexing.
Well, there have been a few flaps of Mothman or winged humanid creatures in like Chicago lately, and even Minnesota, weren't there?
Yes. You have Lon Strickler, who's been investigating some of those. Tobias Whalen, who's a fellow Wisconsinite here, has been investigating the Allison Journalin. She's been investigating the Chicago Mothman, which is a terrible name for whatever this thing is, but it needs its own name. I know they're calling it the Lake Michigan Mothman and the like, but it needs its own, moniker. But yeah, it seems like people are seeing these creatures everywhere.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, it really is crazy. So I want to ask you, since you've been around this game for so long and you've been doing this, and you're awesome. I love talking with you. If you were a new investigator and they wanted to pick your brain, what one piece of advice would you give them?
Oh, great question. Gosh, probably the advice I would have wanted to be told when I was starting out is what I would tell people now, that when I started out, like probably a lot of us in this field, we came in thinking high hopes. I'm going to explain what ghosts are. I'm going to figure out what UFOs are. I'm going to figure out this and solve this mystery and that one, and this will be easy. And I think a lot of people that get into it like I did, like that you can burn out very quickly when you go to a lot of these places and maybe nothing happens, or there are more questions coming out than answers. And I think sometimes you'll burn out very quickly. So I learned early on that I shifted my perspective to seeing these things as folklore stories and as an adventure, that I want to go to these places, research these things, interview these people, but make an adventure of it. Travel the back roads, hit the roadside attractions, and see it as a big picture adventure. Because otherwise, I think I would have burned out when nothing happens for so many times. So I think I would tell people that, make it fun. That if you like to travel and stay at mom and pop motels or camp, whatever you like doing, do it that way. There's really no one way to investigate these things. If you want to use a ton of equipment, go ahead. If you don't, and you're more interested in just, documenting it or interviewing people, that's great as well. So I think I would tell people that, see it as the adventure, and you'll never run out of legends if you see it more as folklore, rather than trying to solve a lot of these questions that I don't frankly know if they can be solved.
Yeah. I mean, that you kind of have to be a historian as well when you're dealing with these cases, because that really helps it out, I'm sure. Like knowing the background, like you're like an encyclopedia of this stuff, man. So,
well, I think that's another drawback of this field, is that so many times people are afraid to say, I don't know. I don't know that. Have you heard of this thing? Nope, never heard of it, but I know somebody wrote a book about it. I'm going to grab that book and read it. And I think that's another thing that a lot of people in this field, I think they should start reading some of the older researchers that were around before all of us. And a lot of them are still around, Jerome Clark and Lauren Coleman and the likes. But then, grab the ones that aren't around anymore. John Keel, Brad Steiger, a lot of these researchers that had been doing it for a very long time, because you might be thinking you have this new theory or idea, but most likely somebody's been there before you.
Yeah.
So, I always have a stack of books from other researchers, and I'm always trying to learn new things because there's just so much of it you can't know unless you're specializing in one thing. Maybe sea serpents is the love of your life, and that's what you want to research. But for those of us who love the entire spectrum of the paranormal, it's impossible to know everything or every new thing. So I think by reading other people's work, I think people are often in this field, I don't think ashamed is the right word, but certainly are not open to saying, I don't know, I'm going to learn from this person.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's a bit of a void in between, like, say, ghost researchers, Bigfoot researchers, and UFO researchers? Do you feel like they kind of don't jive with each other's theories on things? And I feel like there's a whole separation there, is what I'm saying.
I think 100%. And I think it boils back to, again, that feeling that my way is the right way, or my theory is the only theory out there. And I think it's loosening up a bit because more and more places are putting together supernatural conventions or paranormal conventions where they are throwing people who specialize in cryptozoology in there with ghost research or crop circle researchers. So you're getting this bleeding through and this overlapping that I think is very helpful for this field. But yeah, oftentimes, UFO researchers scoff at those who believe Bigfoot may have been seen with UFOs, or you get the flesh and blood crowd that, looks down upon high strangeness, or vice versa. And what I encountered growing up doing this in the Midwest is that this happens so much with ghost researchers, is that you'd reach out and say, hey, I'm doing this research on such and such case. And they wouldn't share anything with you because they felt like that was my area, or that was my case, or that I'm the one who investigates this area. Where, I found that to be very strange, where you don't get that in other fields. You don't get, someone saying you can't research cancer because I'm researching it.
Yeah, it's weird. It really is weird. I mean, I don't understand it at all. And I don't understand. Another thing that bothers me is when people say, I'm a paranormal investigator. Well, what part of paranormal do you investigate? They're like, oh, just ghosts. Well, yeah, you are a paranormal investigator, but there's more to the paranormal than just ghosts, you know? And
Yeah, and I agree. That aggravates me as well. And that usually happens, as you're a great example, is that usually ghost groups will call themselves paranormal researchers or investigators, where you never hear, you know, UFO researchers or cryptozoologists saying they're paranormal. They're more specific, but that ghost seems to be a catch-all. Yeah, you're definitely correct there.
yeah, it's really strange. I mean, I think that if they would actually, people would actually network and work together, I mean, we may be able to move at figuring some of this stuff out faster together, you know?
And I'm on the other side of it as well, that people contact me saying, I want to do some research on the Van Meter visitor or something else, but I don't want to step on any toes. And I'm thinking, do the best you can. Maybe I'll learn something from you digging up something that I wasn't able to do. So again, that territorial measures that sometimes go on in this field are a little bit mind-boggling. And I agree with you that I think if we shared more, I think this field might progress a little bit more.
Yep, I think so. Well, Chad, I want to ask you one last thing. Where are you moving to next? Where are you going to next? What's your next big thing?
Well, right now I'm finishing up a book that's more folklore based, and it's dealing with the lumberjack creatures of the Northwoods, and obviously fictional, but things like the hodag and the hoop snake and the hide behind up in the Northwoods of the Great Lakes. In the 1800s and early 1900s, tens of thousands of men would go into the lumber camps all winter long and stay with other men, cutting logs all day and then going back to the bunkhouse and at night spinning yarns, telling tall tales. And they created all of these legendary wood monsters, these creatures of the forest that would usually try to scare greenhorns, rookies. And I've collected a bunch of these stories of just these magnificent creatures that only existed in the imagination of lumberjacks. And I'm putting that out next. And again, I think today my focus on the paranormal is on the outskirts, where folklore and supernatural combine or cross over, where, you know, these creatures aren't in the field of cryptozoology. Nobody's pretending that they even were thought to exist, but I'm still fascinated by them. You know, there still need that entertainment, that when you're walking through the woods, you know, that you hope that there's this hoogag creature that looks like a moose with its mouth reaching the forest floor, waiting to greet you. So, you know, I'm curious about that. You know, circus and carnival legends as they pertain to the supernatural, hobo legends when it talks about ghosts and haunted trains, all these things that are just on the outskirts of what you would consider paranormal. That's where a lot of my interest is in the foreseeable future.
That's awesome, man. That sounds like a lot of fun. I can't wait to read that one, man.
It is. And after my last book was on supernatural dares, where people go to supernatural places and they have to do something like knock on a grave 3 times to get an answer, you know, those type of things. And so much of it was bad things were going to happen to you, mishap, misfortune, and death. If you did these things, a portal to hell will open up and swallow you in, or you'll be cursed with bad luck until the day you die. That after doing so much of that, I said, I have to do something a little more fun. And that's where the lumberjack creatures kind of rolled in.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of fun, man.
And that's the thing. I think people need to investigate what they like. If you don't like investigating a certain thing, there's no rule that you have to.
Right.
So, yeah, I think some of these groups take themselves a little too seriously with forgetting that it's meant to be fun at the same time as serious. Yes, it can be as scientific as you can try to make it, and rigorous as your standards, but if you're going to survive it, it's going to have to be fun at some level.
Agreed. Where can everybody out there find you and find your books and all the neat stuff that you've worked on?
if you want to find me, think of the weirdest legend you can think of and then go there. You'll probably find me there. But if you want to find my books, just Chad Lewis Research is the easiest place for you to check it out.
Yeah, that's a pretty good website too, man. I've been perusing it the last few days.
Yeah, and I'm always interested if people want to tell me a story, share their experience. I'm often really excited to hear new stories of the strange and unusual.
Hey, what do you know about the Lizard Man down here?
Great book. Lyle Blackburn, a colleague of mine, who, if you haven't had him on your show yet, you should probably do that. Fantastic book on the Lizard Man. Again, another one where this thing shouldn't be alive. There should be nobody seeing a giant human-looking lizard-type creature walking or strolling about. It just shouldn't happen, but yet it is happening.
I have a theory on that one.
Yeah, what is it?
I think that it was a Bigfoot, actually, that just crawled out of the swamp, and it was misidentified. That's my theory.
And again, who knows? It could be. I did a book on the Big Muddy Monster, which was this Bigfoot, or is this Bigfoot-like creature down in southern Illinois that came out of the river, and it was covered in fur, and it was caked on mud from its bottom half. And they called it a Bigfoot-type creature because that's the only thing they could describe it as. But much like your theory with the Lizard Man, it could have been something completely different, but yet it was too weird. It didn't fit into any category. So let's just say it was a Bigfoot.
Yeah.
So you're completely right that, again, some of these things might have been misidentified, or the mind just kind of fills it in the way it wants to.
Yeah, you see what you see, you know?
Yeah. So I love theories like that. Again, it comes down to that believing that you don't have all the answers. That when you say Bigfoot misidentified, well, yeah, let's look into that. Could it possibly be that?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's what I talked to a Bigfoot researcher the other night, and I bounced a few theories off of him, and he bounced a few off of me. And I said, the thing is, we're never going to know until we have one in front of us alive and unravel it right there. That's the only time we're going to know, right then and there.
I agree completely.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I enjoy this stuff, and I certainly enjoy reading your material and seeing you on TV and talking with you, man.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, and I'd like to talk to you again sometime.
Yeah, let's do it again, and keep an eye out.
Oh yeah, I will. I have some cool stories from down here I want to share with you in the future, so.
Yeah, let's do a new episode in the future. We'll just swap stories.
Sounds good to me, man. Sounds good. Hey, Chad, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk to me and talk to my listeners, and it is really, really appreciated.
Well, that about does it for Dreamland tonight, dreamers. If you like the show, please remember to hit the subscribe button and feel free to leave us a review. Thanks again for listening, and good night.